Well, hello everybody. It is February 23rd, 2020, and I find myself today in San Antonio, Texas. And behind me you can see one of the most recognizable, iconic historical sites in the United States, if not the world, and that is the church that has come to be known as the Alamo. It was here 184 years ago today that a Mexican army under Antonio López de Santa Anna came to besiege the Texian forces under command of William Barrett Travis, Jim Bowie, and of course Davy Crockett. And after 13 days took this location from the Texian defenders, killed almost all of them, and it came down to be known as the Battle of the Alamo. Now, because this area is largely different than it was in 1836, it's very difficult to be able to make a video where I talk through the historic battle. Other than the chapel behind me, there's very little of this location that looks like it did in 1836. So instead, what I've decided to do is just show you some of the sites as they exist today. We'll talk a little bit about some of those things, and we will talk about what we can of the history. So the area where I'm standing is kind of a plaza that's only for pedestrians, and if you see, if I turn around to where I'm facing the church, you can see there's a lot of commercial area here, and on this side behind me is the Cenotaph that remembers the defenders of the Alamo. This actually, a lot of people don't really understand that the church itself is not, that is not kind of the entrance that was being assaulted. This area where I'm standing was all inside of the fortress. This whole kind of open courtyard area was part of the area that was defended in the Alamo. It extended down that way. I'll kind of throw up a map to give you a better sense of that and where I'm standing. But let's take a look around. Well, as many folks know, the building behind me was part of a mission that was founded on this site in the early part of the 1700s. This present site and this present chapel behind me the cornerstone was laid in 1744, so it was about 80 years old by the time of the Battle of the Alamo. This was obviously a strategic location because many different times throughout a century or more, soldiers were stationed here, and this mission was turned into a fort. It flew the flag of 5 separate nations over that time: Spain, Mexico, the independent nation of Texas, and the Confederate States of America, and the United States of America. So let's take a look inside. So I just came through touring the chapel, and unfortunately you're not allowed to film or take photos inside or touch the walls. It's very soft limestone that is deteriorating. It's in pretty poor shape, and so they're doing a lot to conserve and try to keep it going as best they can, but I can't really show you anything from inside of there.
You probably would have done it if you knew how bad it was going to get. And so the same guy, see, we had chased the Mexican army out 2 months earlier. And so the same guy cast 3 on his back. The same guy who drew the shots in the second hill. And so, but they didn't notice in native military that Santa Anna had 3 passions in life. He's famous for saying it.
They fight in those outfits?
Women, of course. And
When I pull the trigger, that flint strikes that steel. Sparks fly into the powder priming. It ignites the priming, detonates the main cartridge, and the bullet goes down.
So you're saying it's a piece of scrap?
Yep. Yep.
So you have powder, lead bullets.
It's fine. You can put your arms there.
In 1877, the Army moves to new larger quarters. This is the last time the Alamo was used as a military outpost. But it's not abandoned for long. As the railroad expands across Texas, San Antonio grows as well. Soon, the city expands over the river towards the Alamo, and the property becomes valuable for development. A French businessman named Honoré Grenet buys the log barrel defending the Alamo in 1836. The rest of the Alamo remains in private hands. As the 20th century approaches, instead of offering protection, the Alamo itself needs to be protected.
In this courtyard behind me, which is just, if you're looking at the front of the Alamo, would be to the left of the church. Inside the compound structure, there are statues of some of the more prominent figures. Beautiful bronze statues. Statues to people like Juan Seguin, David Crockett, William Barrett Travis, Jim Bowie, and Susanna Dickinson. I'll let you get a look at each one of those.
Maybe it's like skunk. Some people can't smell the cat pee smell.
Edited newspaper does that. I lost my smile when you said that.
I know, but I wanted him to smile, so it's okay. There's your wife here.
What?
There's your wife.
Maybe in another life?
You smile for her.
No. You running away?
Well, she's not. your head.
Daniel, tú te pones enfrente de mí. Excuse me.
I'm standing in perhaps the only spot in San Antonio where you can actually get a little bit of a sense of the open space around the Alamo at the time of the battle. I'm east of the Alamo, near the intersection of Bowie and Houston streets, in a huge parking lot next to some shopping centers. Right behind me, where you see the trees, is where the Alamo is. So I'm east a couple of 100 yards away, and on the morning of the assault, just after midnight, well, I should back up. At about 10 o'clock that night, the constant bombardment by Mexican artillery on the Alamo ceased, which had the desired effect of allowing some peace for the Texian soldiers inside the Alamo, and most of them fell asleep, which is exactly what Santa Anna wanted to happen. Just after midnight, they began to prepare the final assault. Around 2,000 Mexicans, maybe just a little bit less, and I apologize. It's a very loud area here. Something around 1,800 to 2,000 Mexicans prepared their final assault, and they were going to attack from multiple sides simultaneously. And the place where I'm standing is the direction from which Colonel Romero's 400 men would have been attacking on that morning. And they would have been coming across this field, which would have been a field at the time, to assault the wall that existed, the low wall on this part of the defense of the Alamo. I would be directly behind, if you were looking at the entrance to the chapel, I would be directly behind that. The entrance faces to the west, and I'm standing in the east. Behind me is the Cenotaph that memorializes the heroic defenders of the Alamo. One of the most common questions that people have is, where are the bodies of the defenders? Well, after the Alamo was taken, the bodies of the Mexican attackers, the Mexican Army, most of them were buried in a local cemetery, but there wasn't room for all of them, and so in an act that really surprises me, the Mexican soldiers threw the bodies of their comrades in the San Antonio River. But as for the defenders' bodies, they were gathered up and they were placed in two funeral pyres about 250 yards apart from each other, both of them about a third of a mile from the Alamo site. They would lay down a pile of wood, a bed of wood. They would lay bodies on top of it, then another bed of wood on top of that. And around 3 o'clock in the afternoon, they had begun that process, and by 5 o'clock they were ready to light the fires. And the bodies of the defenders, nearly 200 of them, were reduced to ashes. There's a lot of debate about where those ashes were placed afterwards, and we can talk about a few of those locations. So I'm now on a very windy Commerce Street here in downtown San Antonio. Behind me, just over down these steps, is the Riverwalk, a famous area, beautiful location, definitely worth your time if you're ever here. Commerce Street in 1836 was known as the Alameda, and it was a dirt road that ran through the town of San Antonio de Béxar, and it had cottonwood trees on either side. And one thing all of the sources agree on is that this is one of the locations of the funeral pyres, was along this street. And in fact, there are some drawings of the cottonwood trees from decades later that still seem to show the damage from the burning of those fires. And one of the sources says that at least some of the ashes were buried on this site where one of the funeral pyres was. And you can see here that there's actually a plaque memorializing that. It's really very hard to find, and I had to do a little research to find where I was looking for, but I'll give you a better look at this. This is supposedly one of the locations of the remains of the Alamo defenders. So I'd like to close my visits to historical sites by offering my thoughts on what I've seen and what I've experienced. And I decided to do that for the Alamo inside my car. It's a little quieter here, and it's a little easier for me to kind of share my thoughts. So my thoughts about the Alamo. It took me all of about an hour to see everything there was to see at the site itself. Now, there are other places around San Antonio that can be seen, but they require having to pay to park multiple times or do an extreme amount of walking. You could see the cathedral where supposedly the remains of the Alamo defenders, in particular the commanders, are supposedly interred. That's about a mile or so away. There's the park, which once contained the cemetery where the Mexican attackers were buried. It's now a playground and a park, and those bodies have since been moved. That also is about 3/4 of a mile or so away from the Alamo site. So there are some of those other locations that you could visit to make it a little more worth your time. My thoughts on this: if this is a period in history and an event in history you're especially passionate about, then by all means make the trip to San Antonio to see it. But if you're just a lover of history in general and you're looking for places to visit, I wouldn't recommend making a special trip to San Antonio, Texas just to see the Alamo. You'll probably find yourself disappointed. I'm glad I came, but I was already coming here for work, and so it wasn't a big deal for me to spend a little time there. And now that's not to say there isn't a lot to see in San Antonio. The Riverwalk is just a couple of blocks away. It's beautiful. There's a lot to see. There's a lot of stuff for kids here, a lot of other attractions downtown, touristy type things, but for just the Alamo itself, maybe not worth the trip. I might spend that money and time on other historic sites. But I'm glad I came, and I'm glad I was able to share just a little bit of what I saw with you today. Thanks for watching.